degrees out and 61-year-old Cookie is on a crate on the pavement, strumming his guitar and singing to passers-by. This, he says, is his lounge. On the ground next to him is his small mattress. That's his bedroom. All of it is surrounded by road cones to protect his patch. This is home for Cookie. He lives on Auckland streets.
My name's Cookie. What have I got at home? I've just got my mattress, my blanket, my flask, and my sounds, and my guitar.
We are going into winter now. We're in winter right now, Cookie. How tough is it in the winter nights?
Well, tough as this, I just got out of hospital with pneumonia.
How long were you in hospital for?
7 days.
Wow, are you feeling better now though?
I got my medication and everything.
Have you ever been attacked or assaulted? You do?
Yeah, I've had all that. Just that young little up-and-coming gangsters come up and, whack me in the head and put me in hospital. But it's just how it goes, but it's all part of the program, it's all part of the package. You can't do this, you can't just sleep on the street and think, this and this and that. Things happen out here and they happen fast.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies and today on The Detail, homelessness in New Zealand. Why is it increasing significantly in volume and visibility? And what's been done or should be done to address it? What's working, what's not, and what is it really like living on our streets?
The Auckland Council has sent a please help letter to the government over rapidly increasing levels of homelessness. In just 4 months, it recorded a 53% rise in people sleeping rough in the city.
We're seeing young people who, as a result of the decisions the government is making, are ending up on our streets. They're experiencing abuse, harm, they're being traumatised. There's huge risks around their mental health.
The number of people known to be living in cars, parks or on the streets in the city rose from 426 people in September to 653 people in January.
That's 653 Aucklanders sleeping rough. There are many, many more across the country who don't have stable housing, and we'll get to those numbers in a moment. And to explain the increase and what can be done about it, I'm talking to Aaron Hendry, who runs an emergency centre for young people sleeping rough.
If we're really honest, there's been a crisis around homelessness for a very long time in Aotearoa. I think what we're seeing, though, is an escalating crisis. The truth is that no government has really done enough, fast enough to respond to homelessness and respond to youth homelessness specifically. Yet, over this last couple of years, we've seen some very intentional decisions which are exacerbating the crisis and making the experience of homelessness far more dangerous and far more likely to occur because of decisions our government is currently making.
Headlines from the past week alone include from Hawke's Bay, Onekawa shops, feces, threats and window smashings as addicts smoke drugs outside. And from Rotorua, Mayor defends removal of homeless people from a city street, claiming some were taking and selling drugs and having sexual intercourse in public. Cookie has witnessed this sort of behaviour firsthand.
It's just people have got mental health issues and then they haven't got the skills to figure things out properly, so they just smash something or yell and scream and do the haka and all that sort of carry on. I used to be like that too, I didn't know how to... I'm glad I'm not like that anymore.
A father of 6, Cookie has lived on and off the streets most of his life after stints in state homes, a boys' home and jail.
I just had enough of that and I come out here and I changed my evil ways, as they say, and I'm a lot better. I haven't been to court or jail for 10 years, which is a record for me, and I don't want to go back there ever. I don't want to be an angel, I just want to be a better person.
What is the toughest thing about living on the street?
It's actually not tough. Since I've been here, everybody comes up and gives me money, coffees, KFC, lamb chops, all the blankets. I don't even ask them, it's just never ending, and I'm like, no, I don't need any money, I'm all right, and they go, no, and they won't take it back.
Have you noticed, Cookie, over the years, has there been an increase in the number of people who are living on the streets?
Yes, there's been heaps.
What do you put that down to?
A breakdown in the families,
Yep.
their own families. big breakdowns. Like, I remember being down the library, there'd be only a handful of people for feed because people come down there voluntarily and cook food and everything and bring it on certain days. Now when you go down the lines from one end of the road to the other end.
And does that make it tougher for you? Like to be able to access food or...
Sometimes I miss out because I see some women coming up with their kids and they go, oh sorry, there's nothing left, and I end up giving my food to them or someone else does.
Personal question for you, Cookie. Where do you do things like to go to the toilet or have a shower and stuff? Where do you go for that?
Oh, we've got showers over there, but the toilet's up in the Sky City.
Yep. Is the government doing enough? Is the council doing enough? Are you getting enough support, do you think?
I can't say bad things and I can't say good things, but I'd rather just stay in the middle and just say they're not going overboard to help people, but they've got more security out and, what do you got, obedience officers. What's an obedience officer? I thought this was a dog. But anyway.
What do you do? Like, do you get a benefit or how do you get your food and stuff like that?
I'm on the benefit. I'll get paid tonight. And I'd rather get paid later in the week than early in the week because I'll be broke here the next day.
But he says, at the end of the day, all you need is...
Need a good attitude and a guitar.
At the time of the 2023 census, about 112,000 people were estimated to be severely housing deprived. That number has jumped much higher since then, according to those working with the homeless. They blame housing affordability, too high, housing availability, too few, the cost of living crisis and social and systemic factors. Aaron Hendry has been involved in youth homelessness projects for more than a decade. He set up an organisation called Kickback to offer wraparound support for young people sleeping rough, including 24/7 accommodation, health services and legal advice. He says the government is making it harder for vulnerable Kiwis with stricter entry criteria for emergency housing and new requirements that make it more difficult to stay.
One of the real obvious ones which has been discussed is obviously the reforms around emergency accommodation. So the reality that that we've seen and our young people have shared with us and we've stood alongside them often is young people going into work and income, asking for support for shelter and being denied that support and as a result having to sleep on the streets and not being able to get access to housing. The decisions around the reforms around the welfare system, tougher sanctions, which actually have made the welfare system far more toxic for people who are already on the margins and are exacerbating the risk and increasing the risk of people experiencing homelessness, or for our young people who are already experiencing homelessness, actually making it even more difficult to get access to shelter or get access to housing because of the tough requirements on them to meet obligations that sometimes are just not within their capability to meet because of their significant health needs and what's going on in their lives. Decisions around our public housing system. What we know is a real strong public housing program which really prioritised the right to housing is a clear way we respond to homelessness, and yet seeing our government make decisions that are resulting in whānau being evicted from public housing. Some of the things that we've seen at Kickback is whānau who've been evicted from public housing and as a result have ended up on the street, and children, so kids as young as 11 and 14 ended up on the street as a result of that, rather than getting the housing and support they need. So these things are exacerbating homelessness. Even thinking around the private rental market and the no-cause evictions, that takes away a protection for renters that does lead to a risk that more people will experience homelessness. So these are decisions that are being made at the moment that are increasing the risk of homelessness for people, and at the same time there isn't a significant investment and support into looking at what that strategy is to move us away from a space where people experience homelessness and ensuring that we have the right policy and the legislation and service in place to prevent people from experiencing homelessness.
Now, I know you have been proactive and letters have been written and you've been very vocal about this. What are you hearing back from the government? How are they responding?
Look, at this point, I guess it feels that it is not really a priority from this government to respond to homelessness. And, we've seen that through some of the clear decisions that have been made. We haven't really heard a lot back in terms of a real focus on addressing the crisis and addressing the issue, especially around that real clear gap around the emergency housing I think the clear message has been, that shouldn't happen, and it's been sorted out. But, the reality is it's not. And we continue to see young people reach out for support and be denied that support. But emergency housing, and it's become the focus, right? Because I think it's a real clear way we can understand a problem. But actually, by the time you get to that need of emergency housing, we've actually failed already. And we haven't done enough for people to prevent a situation where someone needs that in the first place. And so we haven't really seen a focus on what is the strategy to move us to a place in Aotearoa where none of our whānau or our children or our young people sleep on the street. Whereas the investment in a strategy that could actually ensure that our whānau and our young people are looked after, and that we actually move to a state in Aotearoa where housing is actually achieved as a human right, and all of our whānau and all of our kids can be guaranteed, safe, stable housing.
Homelessness is rising, says the Salvation Army's annual report.
What we believe is that more and more people are falling through the cracks.
For about a fifth of the people leaving emergency housing, government does not know where they have gone. So the likelihood is that a big percentage of those will have gone back to some form of homelessness.
So we know where they are, and we know that they have gone into housing. That's why we report the numbers. We're not making it up. This is fact.
But how do you explain the rise in homelessness that we've seen in Wellington in the past year?
Well, the numbers are bouncing around a bit, and clearly there's a tough economic conditions out there. We've got rising unemployment, tough economic conditions, and we've got an absolute focus in government on reducing homelessness.
If you had control then of the housing and social development budgets tomorrow, what would be the first thing you'd change? What needs to happen to get this back on track and to, have fewer people living rough on the streets?
Look, I think the first thing that I'd like to see us do is actually invest in a strategy that moves us towards thinking about how do we prevent and end homelessness, and get real specific also on a strategy and how we prevent and end youth homelessness. And that would be looking at what are all the key drivers towards homelessness? What are the key pipelines that are funneling our people, our children, our young people into homelessness? And then where do we need to get targeted resources into those services, into those pipelines to actually begin planning to prevent it? And that's not going to happen overnight. But if you've got a plan, you've got a strategy, and you know where you're going, then you know where that investment needs to happen. You know where those services that maybe aren't working right now need to be reformed or done away with. And, in terms of we focus on youth homelessness, we know some really clear pipelines into homelessness. It's the care system, it's the welfare system. The health system is a touch point where we're failing, So we could be putting investment into those spaces, but we need to actually get really clear on what the problem is and define that really well. Look, the next thing I think, tomorrow we could do is start investing in, duty to assist legislation. So, this was trialled in Wales. And basically there's legislation which basically clarified the responsibility on the community and on state agencies to provide support for people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness or who were experiencing homelessness. So in practicality in New Zealand, this would mean that if you went to work and income and you were sleeping on the street, or maybe you were at risk of experiencing homelessness because something was going on, work and income would have an obligation, a legal obligation, to provide you with support to prevent that experience of homelessness or get you shelter tonight so they could start supporting you to get into stable accommodation. And that duty to assist would expand by just, obviously there'd be an obligation on state, but there'd also be an obligation on community agencies and other government services to refer to our state agency, to work and income, to pick up that duty to assist and ensure that people are actually getting the support they need, and shift the mentality from homelessness being an individual problem caused by individuals to actually an understanding that homelessness is a collective responsibility. People who experience homelessness are in that situation often because a whole range of failures within our society, which has led us to a situation where we've got a child or a young person or whānau themselves sleeping on the street. So those are kind of a couple of clear kind of structural things, but there's also services that we could be investing in. So the government's made a decision to move away from motels as an emergency housing crisis response. And to be honest, I think Kickback really agrees with that. The motel model was a failed model. It was a model that really saw huge amounts of public money going into private landlords' back pockets, and at the same time creating an environment where some of our most vulnerable, structurally marginalised whānau were exploited and didn't get the support that they needed, and it actually served to sustain homelessness for a lot of people, and there was a lot of trauma and harm and pain that happened in that space. And so we do need to move away from that model. But what the government has done is just pulled it away without providing an alternative. So, what we should be doing is, while we have that motel model in place, we should be at the same time investing in alternatives. So, developing immediate crisis services so that if someone had nowhere to go, they could turn up, they could get somewhere safe to sleep, they could get their wraparound support, and they could then be pathwayed into stable housing in a way that is safe, in a way that is equitable.
Are they doing anything that is right, that actually is working, that you want to see more of?
I haven't seen a lot under this government. I think some of the things that were glimmers of hope that were starting to come through under the last government was getting some focused funding into youth homelessness initiatives. There needs to be a lot more of that. We know that for a lot of our whānau that experience homelessness long term and have done for a while, like that experience began when they were kids, when they were young people. And so if we want to end homelessness in Aotearoa, we need to put some focus into that, right? The last government was also looking at the public housing build, right? Like ensuring that there is this responsibility on our public housing system to house people and retain people in tenancies and trying to pathway into them to stable accommodation. I think those things were really good. The housing action plan was, there's a few kind of critiques we could make of it in terms of it needing to be a bit more robust and have a bit more focus on priority areas, but it was starting to see some steps in the right direction. And I think a part of that was having a minister that was focused on homelessness as a priority area. It does seem that the energy has dropped off quite a bit under the current government, and I think there needs to be a refocus on this as a crisis and understanding that it is a crisis. It can't just be one of those other social issues that's over there and, maybe we'll get to it, which maybe feels like the energy at the moment. It needs to be something we understand it's actually really serious. Experiencing homelessness is really, really dangerous. It's not just, you're sleeping outside and having a picnic. The consequences are significant trauma. It's often really significant mental health deterioration, physical health deterioration. In the worst case scenario, people die in really dangerous and complex situations. And, when you think about then children and young people that are experiencing homelessness, the risks just grow. Right now, we're seeing more, through our outreach service, The Front Door on K Road and Auckland Central, right? We're seeing more and more children turning up through our doors. The youngest we've seen is a 9-year-old, right? Experiencing homelessness in dangerous situations, really unsafe. This shouldn't be occurring. If my child was sleeping on the street in Queen Street tonight, it would be a crisis for me, and I would do everything I could to make sure that child was looked after, right? I think our government needs to understand that they have the same level of responsibility for children in this country and for all of us as a society. And we need to understand that homelessness is a crisis and respond to it with the energy that a crisis would demand.
Are we seeing sort of more first-time homeless people, people who never imagined they'd end up without a roof?
Yeah, I mean, we see at Kickback, we see mostly young people and children, and we are definitely seeing young people come through that, this is their first experience. I remember a young wahine that turned up at our space and she was just terrified. She spent the night sleeping rough and she'd gone into work and income and been, we had to advocate for a shelter that night. She went sent to a lodge where it just was clearly unsafe. I wouldn't want to sleep there myself, let alone leave my daughter in that environment. And the fear in her eyes as we had to allow her to leave our space without a safe or stable place to go. Like that is New Zealand. And I think we don't like to think about that in New Zealand, that we live in a country where we can have children and young people and vulnerable whānau reach out to state agencies for support and be denied that support. Or if there is support given, that the support is given and it's not safe and it's not stable and it's not places where most of us would want to live. That's where we are. And that's horrific, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's the thing we have to get really clear on. I think there's sometimes a mentality when we talk about homelessness that it's an unfortunate thing, it's sad, but there's always going to be homeless people. There always has been. We don't have to accept that in New Zealand. Homelessness is a result of some really clear policy decisions we make. It's a result of decisions to allow housing to be a commodity. And for our governments not to take a real, to own their responsibility to ensure that all of our people can be housed and to ensure that there is an access to housing and that we are regulating the housing markets. So there is access to housing and security of housing for our communities and for our people. Our government needs to take far more responsibility on that. And I think as a country, we need to understand where we are if we're going to be able to move forward.
Local organisations often try to help people living rough, but this can lead to fallout for the rest of the community. In Aotearoa, for example, a charity has been offering free showers and laundry, and the Salvation Army allow people to sleep in their doorway. But local businesses say their antisocial behaviour is sometimes driving customers away.
Rotorua police have arrested 13 people in a 3-day crackdown on homeless people with shopping trolleys. The action followed complaints of threatening behaviour in the city's business district. They say being homeless is not a crime, but antisocial or unlawful behaviour will not be tolerated.
Aaron, give me an insight into why homeless people sort of lash out and behave like this, smash windows, have sex in public. Why do they do this, and how do you fix that?
Yeah, I think we have to be really clear first that the people without homes are not the problem, right? And how would you manage not having a stable place to live? How would you manage if you were living on the street alone? If you were outside in the freezing cold? Last night it bucketed with rain. It was icy cold. Like, if that was your life every single day, what impact would that have on your physical health? What impact would that have on your mental health? How might you deal with complex situations that happen every day where, you're never safe and you're always having to fight for survival, you're always having to fight just to live, just to be able to have a piece of pavement to lie down on? If that street is everything, that's all you have, then yeah, some of the behaviour is the trauma, the pain, you're going to see that on the street. The real problem is that, our whānau, our people don't have safe places to live, that they don't have a home. That's the issue. And sometimes we get focused on, this behaviour that we see as being the problem, but actually the real issue is that we have human beings living on our streets in our major city centres, and they don't have homes to live in. That is the problem what we should be targeting and need to focus in on. And if we get clear on that and we understand our collective community responsibility to care for people and ensure that we're all housed, we will deal with these challenges, right? But as long as we're content to allow our own people, our children, our young people to live on our streets, we're going to deal with that complexity in our communities.
Some businesses right throughout the country, they see the homeless and they think, right, we're going to give you free coffees and we're going to do free laundry for you to help out. But then paying customers will see them outside their store and go, well, we're not going to go in there. So they lose business because then people get scared. What's your take or advice on that?
Sometimes the fear that I observe in the community comes from ignorance and a lack of knowledge, but they're human beings and they're part of our community. And sometimes when we're putting our energy against individuals that are actually the victims of a system that has harmed them, what we should be starting to do, I believe, is step back and start to look at where do we need to put that attention. And it really needs to be a growing reality in New Zealand that we as a collective are demanding that there is a right to housing for people in New Zealand and that our governments are going to be accountable to ensuring that it is delivered.
If you had the ear of Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, what would you say?
What would you do if your child was sleeping on Queen Street tonight? If your child was on K Road tonight and you could do something about it, what would you do? And then I think I'd remind him that he can do something. That right now, the government could make some really clear decisions to start working towards a future where homelessness doesn't exist. They could roll back their emergency housing reforms. They could roll back their reforms around the welfare system, which has made it more punitive on people. They could start committing to a strong public housing build program and ensure that young people are prioritised in their policy and their decision making. They could invest in a strategy to end and prevent homelessness, and they could deliver duty to assist legislation to ensure that this situation never happens again, where children and young people turn up to work and income and get denied support and are turned away onto the street. And so, look, it's possible. And our Prime Minister right now could make some clear decisions and they could end this. They could start to lay the foundations to building an Aotearoa where homelessness no longer exists. And we never again have a situation where people sleep on our streets, where one day our kids look back on this time and they think, how in the world was it that anyone allowed children, young people, whānau to live on their streets? That seems just horrific. And we will build a future where that becomes completely horrific to us and we never see it as a reality going forward.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Cookie and Aaron Hendry. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Mark Chesterman. I'm Amanda Gillies. Mā te wā.